Picture this. You've just stepped through a time portal into the bustling streets of London, circa 1350. The first sensation that hits you isn't the sight or sound, but the smell. A nauseating cocktail of human waste, rotting meat, unwashed bodies, and death that's so overwhelming you immediately start retching. Welcome to medieval city life, where simply walking down the street was a full-contact sport with disease, violence, and filth that would make a modern sewer seem like a luxury spa. If you think navigating today's urban streets is challenging, prepare to discover why medieval city dwellers had a life expectancy shorter than a mayfly, and why most people who entered these urban hellscapes never lived to tell the tale. Because surviving in a medieval city wasn't just about finding food and shelter. It was about dodging literal rivers of sewage, avoiding plague-infested rats the size of small dogs, and navigating a social structure so brutal that one wrong step could mean instant death or a fate much worse. And if this glimpse into urban medieval horror is already fascinating you as much as it fascinated me when I first uncovered these shocking truths, consider hitting that subscribe button, because we have countless more historical nightmares waiting to shatter your assumptions about the past. Let's start with the most basic challenge of medieval city life, simply moving through the streets without dying. Medieval city streets weren't paved roads as we know them today. They were narrow, winding death traps made of packed dirt, cobblestones, and whatever organic matter happened to accumulate over time. And by organic matter, I mean a festering mixture of animal dung, human excrement, food scraps, dead animals, and the occasional human corpse that nobody had bothered to remove yet. The streets were so narrow that two people could barely pass each other without physical contact, which was particularly problematic when you consider that personal hygiene was a foreign concept, and most people carried enough diseases to wipe out a small village. Buildings on either side leaned precariously inward, creating dark, tunnel-like passages where sunlight never reached, and where the air was so thick with toxic fumes that breathing itself became a health hazard. But here's where it gets truly nightmarish. Medieval cities had no concept of waste management. Residents simply threw their garbage, including human waste, directly out of their windows into the streets below. The famous cry of "Gardy Lou," which warned pedestrians that sewage was about to rain down from above, was literally a matter of life and death. Getting caught in a shower of human excrement wasn't just disgusting. It was a potential death sentence in an era where a simple infection could kill you within days. The streets became rivers of filth that flowed downhill, carrying with them a toxic soup of decomposing matter that attracted swarms of rats, flies, and other disease-carrying vermin. Walking meant wading through ankle-deep muck that squelched and bubbled with gases from decomposing organic matter. The wealthy wore special wooden shoes called pattens to elevate themselves above the worst of the filth, while the poor had no choice but to wade through this bacterial nightmare in whatever footwear they could afford. And speaking of footwear, if you're finding this historical reality check as eye-opening as we do, a quick subscribe would help us continue digging up these buried truths that textbooks conveniently forgot to mention. Now let's talk about the housing situation, which makes modern slums look like luxury accommodations. Most medieval city dwellers lived in overcrowded tenements that were basically vertical death traps waiting to collapse, burn down, or simply rot away with their inhabitants inside. These buildings were constructed entirely of wood, thatch, and other highly flammable materials, packed so tightly together that when one caught fire, entire city blocks would go up in flames within minutes. A typical urban dwelling housed anywhere from 10 to 20 people, in spaces barely large enough for a modern closet. Families shared single rooms with multiple other families, strangers, animals, and whatever vermin happened to take up residence. Privacy was non-existent. Sanitation was a joke, and the air inside these hovels was often more toxic than the street air outside. The floors were made of packed dirt, covered with rushes that were changed maybe once a year, if residents were particularly fastidious. These rushes absorbed every bodily fluid, food scrap, and waste product imaginable, creating a fermenting carpet of organic matter that bred diseases like a medieval petri dish. Walking on these floors meant stepping on layers of accumulated filth that had been compressed into a toxic paste that stuck to everything it touched. Windows were tiny openings covered with oiled cloth or animal skin, providing virtually no light and even less ventilation. Most residents had never seen direct sunlight inside their homes, living in perpetual twilight that was broken only by the flickering light of candles that filled the air with toxic smoke and provided barely enough illumination to navigate the cramped spaces. The sleeping arrangements were particularly horrifying. Multiple families shared beds that were essentially piles of straw crawling with lice, fleas, bedbugs, and other parasites that fed on human blood throughout the night. People slept fully clothed, not for warmth, but because removing clothing meant exposing more skin to the army of blood-sucking insects that ruled the darkness. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval city housing was the complete absence of any building codes or safety regulations. Structures were built by whoever felt like building them, using whatever materials were available, with no consideration for structural integrity or fire safety. Buildings regularly collapsed without warning, crushing their inhabitants under tons of rotting timber and debris. Fire was an omnipresent threat that could incinerate entire neighborhoods in a matter of hours. The Great Fire of London in 1666 wasn't an anomaly. It was simply the most famous example of what happened regularly in medieval cities. Fires started from cooking hearths, overturned candles, or lightning strikes would spread with unstoppable fury through the tinder-dry wooden structures, often killing thousands of people who had no escape routes and no firefighting services to rely on. Now let's discuss the food situation, which was less about nutrition and more about survival roulette. Medieval cities had no refrigeration, no food safety standards, and no reliable supply chains. Most food was either spoiled, contaminated, or outright poisonous by the time it reached consumers, but people ate it anyway because the alternative was starvation. The typical medieval city dweller lived on a diet of stale bread, rancid beer, and whatever scraps of meat they could afford. The bread was often made with flour that contained significant amounts of sawdust, ground bones, and other non-food additives that bakers used to increase profits. The beer, which was safer to drink than water, was weak, sour, and often contaminated with bacteria that caused violent stomach ailments. Meat was a luxury that most people could afford only occasionally, and when they did get it, it was usually on the verge of putrefaction. Butchers had no way to preserve meat, so they used heavy spices and salt to mask the taste and smell of decomposition. Eating meat was literally gambling with death, but the alternative was slow starvation on a diet of bread and beer alone. Fresh vegetables and fruits were virtually non-existent in medieval cities. The few that made it to market were usually wilted, wormy, or rotting, sold at premium prices to desperate customers who had no other options. Scurvy, rickets, and other nutritional diseases were rampant, creating populations of malnourished city dwellers whose immune systems were too compromised to fight off the constant barrage of infections. The water situation was even worse than the food. Medieval cities had no clean water sources and no sewage treatment. People drank from wells that were contaminated with human waste, rivers that served as open sewers, or cisterns that collected rainwater along with whatever debris, dead animals, and toxic substances happened to fall from the sky. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid were constant companions of urban life, spread through contaminated water that everyone had no choice but to drink. These diseases could kill within days, turning healthy individuals into corpses so quickly that families often woke up to find their loved ones dead in their beds, victims of waterborne pathogens that struck like invisible assassins in the night. But the real horror of medieval city life wasn't just the physical dangers, it was the complete breakdown of law and order that made every interaction potentially fatal. Medieval cities were ruled by whoever had the most money, the sharpest sword, or the most ruthless followers. Justice was arbitrary, punishment was brutal, and violence was so commonplace that most people witnessed multiple murders, rapes, and assaults as part of their daily routine. The streets were controlled by gangs of thugs who extorted protection money from anyone who wanted to conduct business or simply walk safely from one location to another. These criminal organizations operated with complete impunity, often enjoying the protection of corrupt city officials who took their cut of the profits in exchange for looking the other way. Theft was not just common, it was practically a city-sponsored activity. Pickpockets, cut purses, and armed robbers operated in broad daylight, knowing that their victims had no legal recourse and no police force to turn to for help. Most people carried weapons not for offense, but for the simple hope of surviving long enough to reach their destinations alive. The punishment for crimes, when it was administered at all, was designed more for entertainment than justice. Public executions, floggings, and torture sessions were treated as community events where entire families would gather to watch fellow human beings suffer and die in the most gruesome ways imaginable. These spectacles served as both deterrent and entertainment in a society that had become desensitized to human suffering. Women faced additional dangers that made their survival even more precarious. Sexual assault was so common that it was barely considered a crime, and women who reported rapes were often blamed for tempting their attackers. Pregnancy in these conditions was essentially a death sentence, as childbirth without medical care, in an environment teeming with infectious diseases, killed mothers and babies at astronomical rates. Children fared even worse in medieval cities. Most died before reaching their 5th birthday, victims of malnutrition, disease, accidents, or violence. Those who survived childhood were often forced into labor, prostitution, or criminal activities just to stay alive. Child abandonment was so common that cities were littered with orphaned children who formed feral packs that scavenged for survival like human rats. The working conditions in medieval cities were so dangerous that most trades had life expectancies measured in years rather than decades. Blacksmiths died from lung disease caused by inhaling metal particles and toxic fumes. Tanners died from exposure to the poisonous chemicals used to process leather. Construction workers died from falls, cave-ins, and exposure to dangerous materials that slowly ate away at their bodies from the inside. Even the supposedly safer occupations were deadly. Scribes and scholars died from eye strain and respiratory problems caused by poor lighting and toxic ink fumes. Merchants died from the constant stress of avoiding robbery, dealing with corrupt officials, and traveling dangerous trade routes where bandits and wild animals posed constant threats. The medical situation was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval city life. There were no real doctors, only barber surgeons who were essentially butchers with delusions of medical knowledge. These practitioners used the same unwashed tools on multiple patients, spreading infections faster than they could claim to cure them. Their treatments, based on completely incorrect theories about human anatomy and disease, were often more deadly than the original ailments. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or any understanding of infection control. Patients were held down by force, while barber surgeons sawed through bones, removed organs, and performed amputations with tools that were often rustier and filthier than the implements used in slaughterhouses. The most common medical treatment was bloodletting, based on the theory that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors. Patients were bled until they fainted, often dying from blood loss rather than their original conditions. Leeches were applied to every conceivable ailment, draining patients' blood while introducing additional infections through their bites. Pharmacy was equally deadly. Medieval medicines were concoctions of toxic herbs, animal parts, and heavy metals that poisoned patients while claiming to cure them. Mercury was prescribed for everything from syphilis to headaches, slowly killing patients with heavy metal poisoning, while their families paid premium prices for the privilege of being murdered by their healers. But here's an important reality check. Not everyone in medieval cities lived in these extreme conditions. The wealthy merchant class and nobility had access to better housing, cleaner food, and some protection from the worst dangers of urban life. However, even the richest city dwellers faced constant threats from disease, fire, violence, and political upheaval that could strip them of their wealth and status overnight. The nobility lived in fortified compounds within the cities, surrounded by armed guards and high walls that provided some insulation from the chaos outside. They had access to imported foods, cleaner water sources, and the best medical care available, though best is a relative term when dealing with medieval medicine. However, even wealth couldn't provide complete protection from the fundamental dangers of medieval city life. Plague didn't discriminate between rich and poor. Fire consumed mansions as eagerly as hovels, and political violence could see a wealthy merchant family stripped of everything and executed in the public square for backing the wrong faction in endless power struggles. The social hierarchy was so rigid that mobility between classes was virtually impossible, but the precarious nature of medieval life meant that anyone could lose everything in an instant. Wealthy families could be reduced to beggary by a single bad business decision, a change in political winds, or simple bad luck that destroyed their assets and left them as vulnerable as the poorest street dwellers. Religious institutions provided some limited relief from the horrors of medieval city life, but even they were corrupt, dangerous, and often more concerned with accumulating wealth and power than providing spiritual guidance or practical help. Monasteries and churches served as refuges for some, but they were also hotbeds of political intrigue, sexual abuse, and financial corruption that made them almost as dangerous as the streets outside. The church's response to urban suffering was to preach that earthly misery was God's will, and that the poor should accept their fate as preparation for paradise in the afterlife. This philosophy provided convenient justification for the wealthy and powerful to ignore the suffering around them while exploiting the desperate for their own gain. Seasonal changes brought additional horrors to medieval city life. Winter meant freezing to death in unheated hovels. Summer meant disease outbreaks that killed thousands, and the transition seasons brought floods that turned streets into rivers of sewage and debris that contaminated everything they touched. Food shortages were regular occurrences that could turn neighbors into enemies overnight. When harvests failed or supply lines were disrupted by war, cities became pressure cookers of desperation, where people would kill for a piece of moldy bread, and families would abandon their weakest members to preserve resources for those most likely to survive. During these crisis periods, cannibalism wasn't unheard of. Desperate people would consume the dead and sometimes the living in their struggle to survive conditions that pushed human beings beyond the boundaries of civilized behavior. These acts weren't considered evil as much as tragic necessities in a world where moral luxury was reserved for those who had never faced true desperation. So there you have it, the unvarnished truth about surviving in a medieval city, exposed in all its horrifying glory. A world where simply staying alive from one day to the next required the luck of a lottery winner, the constitution of a superhuman, and the moral flexibility of a sociopath. A place where death lurked around every corner, in every meal, in every breath of toxic air, and in every human interaction. These urban environments were experiments in human misery that somehow managed to survive and eventually evolve into the cities we know today. The people who endured these conditions were either incredibly tough, incredibly lucky, or more likely, they simply didn't survive long enough to complain about the accommodations. The next time you walk down a clean city street, drink water from a tap, or complain about urban noise pollution, remember these medieval city dwellers who would have considered our worst urban problems to be impossible luxuries. Because in medieval cities, survival wasn't about comfort or convenience. It was about lasting another day in conditions that would make a zombie apocalypse seem like a pleasant vacation destination. And since you've made it this far through this journey into urban medieval hell, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop your country or city in the comments below, because it fascinates us to know that these dark chapters of human history are reaching people in every corner of the globe, reminding us all just how far we've come from our nightmarish past. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to appreciate the fact that I can walk down a street without dodging human waste falling from windows above.